The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to IPMG's Professional Development Workshop. I am glad everyone is able to join us today, and I am very excited to be able to introduce to you Dr. Rita Weller. But before I do that, I would just like to go over a few things related to the GoToWebinar system. You are in listen-only mode, but we do encourage you to type in any questions that you may have in the question section, which is on your dashboard. And we will take questions at the end of the presentation, as many as we have time for today. Also, all attendees will receive a follow-up email in 2 business days, with an attendance certificate link attached. So if you do need to use this for continuing education or training credit, you would use then that certificate that will come with that follow-up email that will go out to all attendees within 2 days. If you have any issues with that, you can contact our customer service department at customerservice@gotoipmg.com, and we'll be able to help you sort that out. I would also like to say that our today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website in the podcast section. So you would be able to access the recording as well as the information and any question and answer. Again, that will be posted within 2 days or so, so at the beginning of next week that will be available on our website. For future workshops that we have upcoming, in September, we will welcome Kathy Boswell from InSource, and she will be presenting information on skills for effective parent advocacy. And then in November, Ruth Roberts, who is IPMG's Request for Approval Specialist, will be presenting information on understanding the Medicaid waiver request for approval process. Both of those workshops, the information will be announced along with the registration, but if you want to mark your calendars now, InSource will be on September 21st, and the Medicaid waiver request for approval process will be on November the 16th, both starting at 11:30 a.m. Eastern, and we'll be sharing the registration for that very shortly. It is now my pleasure to welcome back Dr. Rita Weller. She has been a guest speaker of ours in the past, and I'm very excited she was able to join us again today. Dr. Weller is the assistant professor at the Department of Social Work at Kutztown University in Pennsylvania. She has over 20 years clinical experience working primarily with children and adults that have experienced trauma, as well as supporting sexual minorities and individuals with disabilities. She maintains a small private practice, and she holds undergraduate degrees in sociology and Spanish from the State University of New York. She received her Master of Social Work from Temple University and her Doctor of Philosophy degree in Education with a concentration in human sexuality from Widener University in Pennsylvania. She is licensed in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in social work and maintains professional memberships with the National Association of Social Workers, the American Association of Psychologists, Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, Pennsylvania Association of Undergraduate Social Work Education, the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality, and the National Association of Case Managers. Currently, she is serving as the president of Pennsylvania Association of Undergraduate Social Work Education. She is also on the board of directors, the board of directors president for Quest, Inc., which is a not-for-profit training and employment agency in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, and is on the board of directors as well as the program committee chair for Service Access and Management Incorporated in Reading, Pennsylvania. So again, I'm very honored that Dr. Weller is spending time with us today, and I'm now going to turn the workshop over to her.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining me on this Friday morning in the summertime. But the topic that I will be discussing is LGBTQ and intellectual disability. So let's get into it. So essentially, what I hope that you all get from this presentation is some understanding or some recommendations around therapeutic interventions for dealing with this concurrent identities populations, the way I'll refer to it, being individuals with an intellectual disability that also identify as a sexual minority as part of either LGBTQ population. Additionally, we'll be talking a little bit about state evidence-based practices related to supporting these individuals with these dual identities and looking at what are some of the community resources available to this population. So I just wanted to provide you with some of the terminology, and I didn't want to make any assumptions that everybody knows what all these acronyms mean and so forth, because sometimes it can be confusing. And actually, this acronym LGBTQ has been growing. There's like an AI on it as well. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm really discussing, for the most part, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, questioning, and/or queer individuals, and that's what LGBTQ stands for. Now, sexual orientation really is about who people are attracted to, more so than anything. And of course, homosexual, often we refer to lesbian or gay, and then of course, heterosexual, often referred to as straight. And of course, the bisexual individual is attracted to both genders. And then transgender has to do with gender identity and not necessarily sexual attraction. So it really is talking about how the person's natal gender, which is actually, natal gender refers to anatomy. Were they born with a penis or vulva? And how their natal gender really does not match their identity. And then queer is just self-labeled by some people who are members of the LGBs, and some heterosexuals who may have some unusual sexual practices. Okay, so, and of course, I'm sure everybody's aware of intellectual disability and what that is, but I thought I would put it in there anyway. So this is the most recent description of intellectual disability provided by the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, written by the Association of Psychological, the American Association of Psychiatric Association. So, as we know, individuals who have an intellectual disability, you have to meet these three criteria in order to have that diagnosis. And the first being around intellectual functioning, which really is related to the person's IQ. And then the second one being that they have deficits in daily living activities, such as with communication, socializing with their peers, being able to live independently. And of course, the last one is that it has to happen before this diagnosis needs to be determined before they're the age of 18. Another one that I had thought that would be important to look at is, and again, this is from the American Psychiatric Association, from the DSM-5 that was published in 2013. And just to give you a little bit of background information on this diagnosis, gender dysphoria, there was quite a bit of conflict, from my understanding, when there was discussion around should they eliminate things such as paraphilias and transsexuals and transgender ended up under paraphilias within the edition before this of the DSM. So there was some compromise around should we even have anything related to transgender, because most people who are transgender would say, well, I don't have a mental illness. That's not my issue. My issue is that my identity doesn't match my anatomy. But as a compromise, they did come up with the gender dysphoria diagnosis, because some individuals felt that if they didn't have diagnosis in the DSM-5, then they wouldn't be able to go for behavioral health care, because they would need a diagnosis in order to get their insurance to pay for those things. So some people do get diagnosed with gender dysphoria, but from my experience working with transgender population, most of the individuals seek out behavioral health support because of anxiety and depression. And it often is related to the way they were treated because of their gender identity and not feeling that their body matches who they were born, that their identity does not match who they identify with. Their bodies don't match their identities. But I put it in there anyway because I thought it's important, because some people do have this, do get this diagnosis. And it's a psychological distress, and essentially it's the mismatch between their identity and their body. So typically it appears in childhood, and people have this strong desire to be the other gender, which causes them a lot of distress. And often I think it's related to social situations and family, where they really do not want to wear the clothing, for instance, is a big deal. They don't want to wear the clothing that matches their anatomy. This causes a lot of distress between families and peers and so forth. But this can also happen to people as they age. I mean, we have seen it in adulthood, and a good example that I think most people are aware of is Bruce Jenner, who then became Caitlyn Jenner, and this happened much later in his life. So just to give you a little bit, I think most people are pretty well aware that people with intellectual disability do suffer a lot of discrimination and bias and mistreatment because they do have an intellectual disability. But put on top of that, layer on top of that, that now they may identify as being lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And so on top of the discrimination and the oppression that these individuals face as having an intellectual disability, now they have this additional layer of oppression and discrimination that they may be facing because of their sexual orientation. So lesbian, gay, bisexual really is focused on sexual orientation, who people love, who people are falling in love with, and who they're attracted to physically. So you can see by the statistics that I put up there that this population really does face strong discrimination, to the point where it's not just verbal harassment, but it's also physical endangerment. And also, often they are kicked out by their families because of their sexual orientation. And they do face a lot of verbal harassment just from family members alone, 28%. 45% face sexual harassment. And then looking at that, we also have learned that there's child abuse, physical, emotional, and sexual, by their families. And as they age, they may be facing some serious mental health consequences because of the abuse as a child as well. Transgender people also face high rates of discrimination. And if you layer on top of the fact that the person may have an intellectual disability, they're transgender, and if they're also African American, they really face more discrimination than all the other groups combined. For the most part, this population tends to live in poverty. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that often they don't finish high school. They don't go on for higher degrees because of the discrimination and harassment that they face while they're in school. And so we know people who do not secure education, not even high school diploma, will often face problems with job employment and getting jobs that really pay them a living wage. I thought this statistic was very interesting and very scary. 41% report attempting suicide, which in comparison to the general population at 1.6%. 55% have lost jobs because of bias on the jobs. 51% reported harassment at school and being bullied. 61% physical assault and 64% sexual assault. Now, I think it's important to talk about how this population and people who are LGBT face a lot of oppression and discrimination, and in many cases, there aren't laws to protect them against this. Now, I did a little bit of research to see, for instance, if Indiana had any protections for this population of LGBT. Now, we know people with intellectual disability, there's a protection in employment and in housing, in federal laws and state laws that do protect people as a class for discrimination, for disabilities. So, for instance, an employer can't fire you and say, well, I'm firing you because you have a disability. That would be a class action suit that could come forward. But I wanted to know if in Indiana protected the LGBTQ population as well, because that's not necessarily they're not a federally protected class. It's actually state by state. And what I'm saying is that in some states, for instance, here in Pennsylvania, you could fire somebody because they are transgender and not face any kind of suit or corrective action for that. So in Indiana, they do protect, there is employment protection for LGBT against discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So that was positive. And additionally, in Indiana, they do allow individuals to legally change their gender. So they could change their gender on their birth certificate and their driver's license as long as they have a statement from a medical doctor that they had appropriate clinical treatment and care. But interestingly enough, in Indiana, if in fact if somebody is being discriminated against or harassed because of their sexual orientation or gender identity, it isn't considered protected under a hate crime, but a bias crime. So they're not, and why is that important? That's important because a bias crime, I'm not sure exactly how they would prosecute a bias crime, but I know hate crimes are protected. So you're a protected class if you have, if you've been targeted because of disability, age, religion, gender. Those are protected classes, but LGBTQ, not necessarily against hate crimes. So if somebody were assaulted because of their race, for instance, the hate crime could apply because that's a protected class, and there'd be a higher level of prosecution that could take place. The person would have, it would be a worse crime. But if you're targeted because you're a part of the LGBTQ population, since it's not classified as a hate crime, it wouldn't necessarily hold the same level of persecution. So the people I'm talking about are individuals who I'll refer to it as they have these concurrent identities. They have an intellectual disability, plus they are part of the LGBTQ population. And so when you put these two together, what you have is really an invisible sexual minority. And these are individuals that are often ashamed, they're confused, and they're frightened. And they really do look for their family and support staff for support and love and care. And so, and if they get rejected by those people, which we've seen, families often reject this population. We as caregivers and providers need to be aware of this and be empathetic and try to listen to their stories and help them as much as we can. And that's why I'm doing this presentation today. So the current issues. So an example of a current issue is, you have this couple, let's say this gay couple, and they are at their day program and they go into the shed behind the program and they get found having sex there. So the typical solution, what agencies will do in this situation is they'll take down the shed. And that's about where it ends at. So rather than helping this couple deal with their relationship and helping them find appropriate places to engage in sexual activities, they just remove the shed and make sure that there aren't those kinds of spaces available that people might engage in sexual activities behind the closed walls. So some therapeutic interventions related to working with this concurrent population. So as was noted in the beginning, my PhD is in education with a concentration in human sexuality. So I'm very biased, and I have to say we need more and more positive sexuality education for people who have intellectual disability, regardless if they're part of the LGBTQ community. I think we need to have better sexuality education for individuals, and it should be positive. It can't be just, well, don't do that. It needs to talk about, especially if we're working with adults, we need to talk about protection from unwanted pregnancies, protection from sexually transmitted infections, how people can keep themselves safe if in fact they do want to engage in sexual relationships, working on relationship dynamics. And what I mean by relationship dynamics is learning how to be in a relationship, in a healthy relationship, how to negotiate sexual activity and negotiate all those things that people need to know how to do in order to have a healthy relationship, how to talk about things that they like and get their needs met, how to be able to tell their partner or partners what they don't like, and so forth. They need more opportunities to practice their skills, their social skills, in interactions with people that aren't disabled. So we can't just always be doing everything in closed sessions with everybody who has a disability, but there needs to be other ways for them to interact with other people in their communities. Another way, which I thought was pretty simple, is just providing them with LGBTQ themed novels, positive information, things that they can look at and you can read to them and read with them. I think that would be a very great experience for individuals to have, because I think this I know from my own personal experiences that having these conversations can be very difficult and can be very tricky. So I think having tools like a themed novel that you can sit down and you can read together is a great experience for both the staff or the family member and the individual to have, because it gives you a chance to really talk about what are their issues? What are the things that they've seen in their lives? What are their worries? What do they need support with? How can we help them? And this way they also can feel a sense of, this is a safe person. This is somebody I can talk to about my issues around sexuality, whatever they are, my issues around relationships, or how I feel about my own body, and those types of things. Again, I did give you the information on the diagnosis of just gender dysphoria, so I think it's important for you to know, just what these people are going through. If they are transgender, that will be helpful to educate yourselves around what their experiences have been, and give you that ability to have those talking points with them about, well, what was it like for you growing up? How were you treated in school? Who were your friends? What kinds of games did you enjoy playing with other people? Those kinds of things. Cognitive behavioral strategies, I think, always work well, especially with the population of individuals with intellectual disability, because here we are having discussions around, okay, how do you deal with disappointment? What do you do to calm yourself down when you're upset? So helping them identify what are their coping skills. But also cognitive behavioral strategies also provide individuals with the ability to practice skills. So this is where you do a lot of role playing and observation. So if you're working with them around accepting who they are, if they're gay, they're transgender, around those things, then talking to them and having them being able to role play with you if they wanted to come out to, let's say, a family member or a friend, and then you can provide them with that feedback of how, well, here are all the possible outcomes of that conversation, and how can you handle this situation, or what can you do in response to a negative reaction or a positive reaction. We hope for positive reactions, but we work with individuals to help them understand that the things that they like and they enjoy, and the things about themselves as a human being, other people may not find positive and say awful things to them, because there is homophobia in our community. So working with them on those things and having them understand that, you know what, you're not alone. There's other people like you who have dealt with similar situations, so maybe we can help find another population for you to engage with. And that's where it goes onto the social supports networks. I think going along with the social support networks, helping them find open communities to interact with. I would say our responsibilities would be to go with them, to accompany them to those places, at least initially until they feel comfortable. And also you can gauge the level of acceptance, because just because they go to an open religious community that supports the LGBTQ community doesn't mean they're automatically going to be supportive of a person with intellectual disability, and vice versa. So I think as part of our interventions, we would also have to provide that level of support to accompany them to those events as well, until they feel comfortable enough on their own. So additional interventions. So asking those open-ended questions about their sexuality and what it feels like to them, and what are their concerns. So I think those are some of the talking points I've come to at this juncture anyway, just really letting them tell us how their life is and how they see themselves, and what are their worries about if they do in fact if they do in fact come out to their family or to their friends or to their job. What are some of their concerns and anxiety around that? This second point here seems simple, but I think it's really tricky using gender-neutral, non-heteronormative language, because I think a lot of times it's so ingrained. So instead of saying the word mankind, we say things like humankind. Instead of saying chairman, we say chairperson, and those kind of things. I think also that goes hand in hand with that can be a little tricky if you're working with somebody who's transgender, is asking them about pronouns. That seems to be a real struggle for individuals, is around, do we call them he, she, that, so asking them, what is your name? What is the name you want to be called? How do you want me to refer to you? How do you see yourself? How do I demonstrate respect towards you? Those kind of questions. And also, I don't want to leave out the fact that we definitely need to provide support to the family and the caregivers of these individuals. And when I say caregivers, I also mean staff. A lot of times people feel very confused themselves, and they don't know how to handle it, and they feel a sense of shame. So I think giving family members and support staff and different caregivers the chance to kind of talk about what is important to them and how they're feeling about learning about the needs of their family member and how they can be more supportive. Also, if you're going to do this work, I think it's important that you demonstrate, you have displays of materials in your office or in your waiting room that really does demonstrate openness. And simple thing could be something like this LGBTQ History Month poster, or ordering, I have this monthly magazine that I get that's called The Advocate. And that has been published since 1967, and it's pretty inexpensive. I think my subscription is like $10 a year. So I mean, just having simple things like that available for in your office and around your workspace, so that people know that you are open and you are a safe person for them to come to. So, getting back to a little bit about why we need to have this discussion with specifically the population of intellectual and developmental disabilities is, interestingly enough, there was a study done in 2003 that said that 24% of the boys and 8% of the girls with an intellectual disability engaged in intercourse by the time they were 16 years old. So that's a pretty good size of kids that are engaging in sexual activity. So by the time they're adults, no doubt they have engaged in sexual activity. Now, in contrast to the general population, I looked this up to see what the difference was. So kids without an intellectual disability, 35% of the boys and 14% of the girls indicated that by the age of 16 that they had engaged in sexual intercourse. So again, we need to have the talk. As much as we would like to think, as much as people believe that kids don't have sex, they won't have sex if you don't talk to them about it, they're having sex. And out of the population, interestingly enough, 10% of the population does relate to being LGBTQ. So I would think that we're probably looking at 10% of the population of people with IDD may also identify as being LGBTQ. So, and if you see the next statistic by the Census Bureau from 2007, they said that from that 10% of the population that indicate that they're LGBTQ, 20% of them received special education services. Again, that doesn't mean that they have an IDD diagnosis, but they can. It's possible. So one of the biggest areas around evidence-based practice in this, looking at these concurrent populations, IDD, LGBTQ. The biggest takeaway that I have at looking at all the different research is there's not a whole lot of research. And the reason why there's not a whole lot of research is because most IRBs, institutional review boards, will not allow this population to be part of research because they think that they won't allow people with IDD, prisoners, because they think that they don't have the capacity to consent. And that is the concern with having this population involved in research. So looking at a couple of ways to get around that, I gave some pointers here is, not to have the research team as part of the person's, staff members or people familiar with them. And we definitely need to come up with better approaches around obtaining informed consent. And I think this goes back hand in hand if we're going to talk about people engaging in intimate relationships. We definitely need to do better around gaining informed consent to make sure that both parties agree and consent to the relationship. And then if in fact we're going to have this group, if we could find this group and do more research around it, they should be compensated for their time, for their participation. And of course, like I said, I had a personal experience in getting turned down by my university's IRB for wanting to do research around working with people with intellectual disability and understanding and supporting their sexual rights. And I have not yet been able to get through that wall. So this is a continued fight on my part of trying to get these individuals engaged in research so we can learn more about them overall around their sexual needs. And maybe we can learn more about their understanding of the LGBTQ. Interestingly enough, though, I did learn, as part of my dissertation, I did do work in this area specifically. And one of the things I learned about this population, which I found kind of unique and intriguing, were many of the responses I got from these individuals they seemed to be overall homophobic. And even from individuals that I was aware and had disclosed that they were engaging in same-sex practices. So people who were engaging in lesbian and or homosexual acts, who had IDD, when asked questions about how they felt about relationships between people who are the same sex, they were often disapproving of it. So, and I think some of that has to go back to maybe it's the way as a culture that we identify with this population. It would be interesting to see what their views are today, because I'm saying this was like over 10 years ago, but it would be interesting to see if their views have shifted at all, that now we do have federal laws for same-sex marriage, for instance. But again, it's hard to get to this research with these individuals because most institutional review boards will not allow it because they feel that this is a population at risk that we could easily exploit. So I think one of the best things I found in looking at when I was putting this presentation together is that there's a lot of community resources. And I don't think that the community resources are limited to larger metropolitan areas. I think, with our technology today, everybody has a lot more access to good information. So I think the first place to start is go to your local library, see what kind of literature that they have there that is supportive of this population, and maybe take out some books with the individual and talk about these things. Also, I think as a culture, we're becoming much more aware of our public spaces with in relationship to transgender. So becoming, really looking at those things like, do we have access to restrooms that are gender neutral for people? Are there gyms that do provide private areas for people to change in so that they can participate and go to those different activities? And also, I think looking at your state laws around things like what can a person change their gender on their driver's license? In Indiana, you can actually, and I think I had indicated that earlier, that you just need a doctor's statement, and it says a physician's statement, and I'm not so sure how in Indiana they, what they consider a physician. Like, for instance, and they have the same ruling here in Pennsylvania. As a licensed social worker and also a person who has a PhD, because now I'm a doctor, but I'm not a medical doctor, I'm also a licensed social worker, I was able to provide my individuals that are transgender with a letter stating that they should be allowed to change their gender identity on their driver's license and their birth certificate, and they were able to do it. So they didn't need to have an MD specifically doing that. Another thing, especially with people that are transgender, finding those medical services that can provide them with quality and support, that can be a little bit more tricky. I think, again, you have to go to maybe some of the bigger cities in order to find that. I know here, I live outside of Reading, which is like the 4th largest city in Pennsylvania, but yet my clients that were transgender had to go to Philadelphia in order to find appropriate medical support services for themselves. And Philadelphia is about a 60-mile drive for individuals, and then getting there, having to pay for parking, having to pay for tolls. So it could be an expensive ordeal for people to have to go to a metropolitan area to seek medical services. So that's a little bit more trickier. I talked a little bit about your state and federal laws. So I think the thing we have to remember is that hate crimes are not necessarily, so hate crimes protect, we know the protected classes are gender, age, race, religion, disability. I don't know if I'm leaving anything out. But depending on your state, LGBTQ people may not be considered a protected class. People with intellectual and developmental disability are. So if they're assaulted because of their disability status, that's a hate crime. But if they're assaulted because they're gay, in Indiana, it's considered a bias crime. So again, that's something you might want to check out. Also, the reason why I bring this up is in Pennsylvania and in Indiana, there are not necessarily uniform laws around protecting people in employment and in housing because of gender identity or sexual orientation. So again, different municipalities may have different laws. So for instance, you might be able to say to somebody, oh, you can't live here because you're gay and I'm not going to rent to you. And in certain municipalities that may be lawful. So they may be dealing with those kinds of discrimination. Another form of discrimination, and I'm not sure how many of you have been aware and watching these things, but there is the federal, I think the federal law, Religious Freedom Act, has gone through. And essentially, that's when if I want a cake for myself and my girlfriend, and we're getting married, and to be two women on top of the cake, the baker can say to me, no, we don't make cakes for people like you. And they can say that to me. So that's just an example of how the Religious Freedom Act. And I think also with the Religious Freedom Act, part of it too is that people that are gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual can be denied the ability to become foster parents. So if an agency says, no, we don't allow that population to be foster parents, they can do that. Okay. So with that, I just wanted to show you these additional resources that are available. So here we have the Association of LGBT issues in counseling. So let me just click on that quickly, and I can show you that that's readily available, hopefully. Here it is. Okay. Yeah, I tried all these. So they bring you, there's all kinds of resources available here that can also help you. That's one. And then Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network is another. Again, these are all available with the click of a mouse, and talking about for children. And it also goes into information for adults. And then for parents, families, and friends of lesbians and gays, PFLAG is often the way we refer to it, is another resource. All right. So these are easily available to everybody. All you have to do is kind of Google them and you can get this information. So what we really need to do is just listen to people, really spend time and help them understand about themselves, their sexuality, their anatomy, and what it is that they want us to help them with. What do they need? Our support. Sometimes people just want you to listen, and that might be all they want you to do. But also for us to understand that if they have both of these classifications of having this concurrent identity, of being IDD, and also part of the community of the LGBTQ, that they have this higher level of oppression and prejudice and discrimination that they may be dealing with. So, and our role is to help them deal with the lack of support sometimes that the communities may not provide them, but help them find those communities that may be supportive. There are communities out there that will support them. With this population, it's extra tricky because of the fact that just because somebody has an intellectual disability doesn't mean that another group is going to welcome them with open arms, and vice versa. As I said, people with intellectual disabilities don't necessarily agree with people being LGBTQ. They too may hold their own homophobic type of views about people that are different. So just because an individual may be part of the same group doesn't mean that they'll be welcomed by either group. And that's important to remember that. So we're looking at a very small niche of the population, but yet part of the population that needs to be supported. So, and also, so the second point I have is letting them, really finding ways to have them actively participate in research. And it's not just people with IDD and LGBTQ. My difficulty has been just being able to do research with adults who have IDD. I think I alluded to it in my first point, is helping them find those safe spaces where they can engage in consensual sexual activity. But again, we have to work with them in what is it to mean to have consensual sexual activity? What is consent? And not only their ability to consent, but the ability of their partner to consent as well. So also exploring and changing the attitudes in staff to develop a culture that does respect diverse sexualities. I think that in itself is really tricky for this population, is learning that, you know, people with disabilities are sexual. People with intellectual disabilities may also be sexual beings, and not only may they be sexual beings, but their sexuality may be very diverse like the rest of the population, and learning how to support them, the caregivers, their family and staff, and all of this spectrum of diversity can be very tricky, but can also be a lot of fun. I mean, I think the point here is, you know, engage people and help them find their way and have fun doing it, and be positive in the approaches and helpful for them. But remember, you might learn along the way that there's been some traumatic events, no doubt. I believe probably 99%, if not 100% of these individuals that fall within this concurrent identities has suffered a great amount of trauma in their past, and maybe currently as well. So keeping that in mind as well. And that is really my presentation. I provided a whole list of references that you can go to. Be careful with the DSM manual, because it is the 5th edition and it was published in 2013. In addition, there were the 2 books that I put in here are part of my references. So the Realm of Possibility is listed, and that's something that you can probably find in your library or order online. And the other book, there's A Small White Scar, and then there's also Peter's Rage, a Love Story. So that is my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weller. That's very good information, very helpful, and I think not only to the individuals that we support, but to ourselves as well, of how to find those resources and that are able then to help us support those individuals. We do have a couple of questions, and we have a few minutes, so if you have any questions that you would like to ask, please feel free to type those in. The first question is asking about how to find or to provide sex education to an individual with intellectual or developmental disabilities that may have been provided in high school that they were not able to participate in. So I know that when you joined us last time, you did provide some resources on ways that families, caregivers, support staff could provide sexual education. But is there any specific resource that you would recommend?
Well, I would say, do you still have the webinar from when we did that?
Yes, we do.
Because that has a lot of that information on there. Those resources are available.
Great. I think what we'll do, I was just going to say, is that when we share this on our website, we can include in the question and answer those resources that you had provided previously. So we will be able to do that.
Okay, good. The other thing I just want to say about that is when you look at those resources, some of them can be a little pricey and some of them aren't. But what I've done was I've called the publisher or whomever has that resource available. I have a school listed in there, and I've called them directly to talk to them, and I explained to them the situation that I worked for an agency and I had people with intellectual disability, and I really don't have any funding source in order to provide these kinds of things. Is there any way they can give it to me at a discounted price? And I found that I would say 100% of the time I was given the answer yes.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. So we will share in the Q&A that we post those resources from the previous presentation. The next question, and I think this is a very common one, is related to individuals that have a legal guardian and their ability to, or is, well, I don't want to say ability, but are they able then to legally consent to sexual activity if they have been adjudicated as a protected person and needing a legal guardian?
You know, that's a great question, because I think it would all depend on what is in that legal guardianship. But I think typically with this population, it's like all, right? It's not typically patchwork. It's like you have legal guardian and control over completely this person. So that's a discussion obviously you'd have to have with the legal guardian, one, and two, I mean, if you looked at your state laws indicate, and I found this throughout the United States, state laws, all of them have in there some kind of capacity to knowledge and understanding. And so the state laws basically say that nobody with an intellectual disability can consent to sexual relationships. But yeah, I would say if a person has a legal guardian, they have been adjudicated incompetent. Probably legally, they're going to say, nope, they can't have sex.
And I think, and I would encourage, because I do think that's a very common concern, but I would encourage everyone to take a look at the resources that we have on supported decision making and ways that you could work and discuss with the legal guardian and the individual to talk about a person's sexuality and what that means for that person. So I would just encourage you to do that as well. This also is a very good question. With the individuals that we work with that receive Medicaid waiver services, many of them have behavior support services because of their sexuality or sexual behaviors. And so the question is asking, how could we discuss with the individual support team, other professional support team members, that their sexuality is not necessarily a requirement for requiring behavior support services, just because maybe somebody identifies as LGBTQ, that's not necessarily a reason that they would need behavior plans, so to speak.
Well, could the behavior plan actually be a positive mechanism to support them? I mean, so I would think they would have the behavior plan because maybe they were having some negative behavioral things going on. Not just because they're lesbian, they may seem like they're lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender.
Right.
So I'm assuming most people with behavior support plans is because there's things going on in their environment. So couldn't the behavior support plan be used as a mechanism to support their sexuality and provide them with positive outlets?
Right. That would be what I would think would be the best use of that. If there are not other behavioral issues, that a person doesn't need support with other behavior or emotional issues, that could be used as a way to support them, not necessarily as a way to prevent them from expressing their personal desires or their sexual identity. So, so for the person that asked that question, which is really great, I think that, that would be individualized to that person, but maybe working with the team and the behavior specialist in making it more of a positive plan to support them, rather than as a way to discourage their sexuality.
Right. And I've working with behavior support plans, what I've always envisioned was basically behavior support plans were put in place to teach staff how to work with the individual and keep them accountable. So,
absolutely. Yeah.
So it could be it could be a mechanism to help staff and the individual.
Sure. I agree with that. Any other questions? I know we are getting close to time. So I, again, want to especially thank Dr. Weller for taking the time to share this with us today. And thank you to all of you that joined the workshop today. I hope you found this information to be useful as you work with individuals and families and other caregivers. We will be sharing this on our website at the first of next week, and then also all of the attendees will receive a follow-up email that will include your attendance certificate that you can use for training credit. If you have any questions, please contact customer service and we'll be glad to help you with that. And I hope to see everyone back in September for our September workshop on skills for effective parent advocacy with InSource related to children who receive special education services. So thank you, everyone. Thank you again, Dr. Weller, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.